Have you ever spent hours trying to nail a hard surface pattern in Blender only to have it completely fall apart when you start to duplicate it and make it repeatable? Nothing's more frustrating than seeing all that effort and time go to waste when your pattern just doesn't align properly.
Oh, no.
But don't worry, I got you covered. Today I'm going to share my pro level workflows to break down and create any hard surface pattern in Blender. Whether it's a simple diamond pattern or an intricate weave, this process will ensure clean, repeatable patterns. No more wasted hours troubleshooting. Patterns are key on hard surface models. They're everywhere, from vehicle grills to fences on environments to even vents on mechanical characters. Mastering these skills will give you the confidence to tackle even the most complex 3D modeling projects. While I'll be using Blender, most of these workflows can be applied to other 3D softwares too. What's going on, you 3D modeling beasts? This is JL Musi. I'm a professional 3D artist with well over a decade of experience. I've created educational content for companies like Autodesk, and my 3D software reviews have been featured in PC Mag. Before we get started, I want to let you know that registrations are now open for the Hard Surface Masterclass. In this free training, we'll dive in even deeper into 3D modeling, and I'll walk you through my simple step-by-step process to create pro-level models that will help you land your dream 3D job. Join over 10,000 students who've already leveled up their skills in my previous classes. This is a limited time event, so don't miss out. Register now using the pinned comment down below. First on the list is the simple pattern. These are built off a grid and are the easiest to create as a seamless, repeatable pattern. This will set the foundation for more complex patterns, so follow along closely. I'll do Shift A, I'll get a mesh and a grid. For this, I want to add a grid with 20 divisions in the X. I like to be able to see my wireframe even from object mode. For that, we'll jump to the viewport overlays and I will enable my wireframe. I do have this set as a quick favorite as well, so this is a lifesaver as I can hit Q and toggle this on. From this point, I'll hit N to bring up my transforms. I want to make this 2 in the X. Since I doubled the amount of divisions on that grid and doubled the scale in the X, I have perfect squares. This is going to work out perfectly as I want to create a diamond pattern. I'll dive into edit mode. I'll select one face, hit A for all. I'll right click and I'll do poke faces. With these faces poked, it gives us the basis for a diamond pattern. Now, we do have to delete the straight edges, so I'll select one edge here, one edge here. We can go to select and similar, but this is a hotkey that's already native with Blender. So I'll do Shift G, it'll give me the same options, and then I'll simply select direction. And right now we have all the edges selected based on the direction that we want to delete. I'll hit X, dissolve edges, and now we have the basis of our grid pattern. I'm going to hit Shift D on this to duplicate this. And this first iteration is going to be wireframe. And then this second one, I'll simply call it detailed. I'll go to the wireframe option. Now Blender has a modifier that will look at your topology and we can select wireframe and that's pretty much it. Blender just took those edges and wrapped geometry around it. So if this is all that you need out of your diamond pattern, you would be essentially done. We can go in here and play with things like the offset, the thickness of this pattern. However, we don't really have the ability to create more complex meshes unless we apply the modifier. I'm going to call this iteration done. Let's work on a detailed mesh. For this, I'll dive into edit mode once more. I'll select one of these faces, hit A for all, and I want to do an inset. Now, by default, the inset's going to treat everything as one unit. What I'll need to do is just drop the inset and we can go and select individual. And now we can basically adjust these individually and set the thickness. So I think this looks pretty good. I'll hit X, delete faces, 7 to go on the top. I'm not a fan of these border edges here created from that initial grid. I'll hit 3 to select my faces. And I'll pretty much drag marquee here. I'll do Control I to invert my selection, X, and delete these faces. Now we're left with a cleaner perimeter. From this point, let's add some thickness to this. We'll add a solidify modifier, offset the thickness, And something with the thickness that we can do is under edge data, we could do a bevel convex. Any of these sub parameters that you don't know exactly what they do, what you can do is actually just hover over this field and they'll tell you exactly what we can do with it. If we want to bevel these edges, yes, we could manually do this, but we could actually use the edge data within the solidify modifier. I'll input 1. Nothing's going to happen because we'll need a bevel modifier. So I'll add the bevel, and what do you know? Now we have our bevel here. So we can play with the settings here. If we actually go to width, this actually gives us a pretty good result. And as a little bonus, we're actually all quadded. You can't always just manually select those border edges and add a manual bevel, but I think I'm pretty happy with what this gave me. So we'll call this pattern done, but let's actually give this some shape. If this was, for example, a grill on a vehicle, this would probably have a little bit of a curvature. To simulate that curvature, what I'll do is I'll get a UV sphere. I also will scale it in the Y just so it's not that round, and this will approximate pretty much the curvature of the front end of a vehicle. Maybe we could scale this up. We'll do Control-2 to add some more subdivisions, and we'll apply that. I'll take our simple pattern here and just rotate it 90 degrees. I'll hit Control-A. We'll apply the rotations. That way we don't run into any issues on the next step. From here, what I'll do is I'll add a shrink wrap modifier, and we want to project this onto the Y, right? If we go here onto the right orthographic, you see that our Y is the axis that we want to project onto. So if we select the Y and now we look at our shrink wrap, it's properly applied. And the great thing about this, we can always hide the sphere here. And since this was done all with modifiers, we could always go back to our solidify, push and pull, as well as play with our bevel. If we wanted to change the bevels around, that's an option that we do have. And since this is via a shrink wrap, if we bring that sphere back, we could actually move this. And as we move this, this is still being projected onto the sphere. All right, so I'm going to right click as I like the original position. And maybe to finish this and make it nice and pretty, we could add a sub D modifier by hitting Control-2. We'll get a matte cap material, enable cavity, disable the wireframe, and this looks pretty good. And that is our completed simple pattern. You're doing great. Next up is the staggered pattern. This one's a bit trickier because it requires an offset piece to align perfectly once duplicated. But don't worry, I'll walk you through how to set it up step by step. Great example is a honeycomb pattern. Let's get started. I'll do Shift A. I'll go to mesh and I'll get a circle. We'll need 6 sides. This is already set to 6, so we're ready to go. Hit tab to dive into edit mode, F to fill, I to inset, and now we're going to pull this in, hit X, and we can delete this face. So this is the first half of our staggered pattern. However, if we were to duplicate this, this would not actually align right as it's not perfectly even on both sides. So this is where the second half of this comes into play. I'll go back to the top view here and I'll do Shift D. This is going to duplicate my mesh. We'll need to access the snap option. So we're going to want to select one vert, which is going to be our active vert, and snap that. We need our snapping set to vertex and active. From this point, we'll dive into edit mode. We'll select the vert that we want to snap from. We'll hit A, and now with snapping enabled, which you can hit this here or you can do Shift Tab. I'll simply do Shift Tab, and now we're going to snap from here to here, right? So this is where knowing the snapping options comes into play. Now we're done with this, so we'll select both of these and we will combine them. So we'll do Control J. These are combined. Now we need to merge these verts. So I'll do Tab to dive into edit mode, 1 for vert mode, and then A for all, M for merge. We'll do distance. Now these are all merged, and this is the beginning of our staggered pattern. From this point, we need an array modifier to build everything within the X direction, and then we'll duplicate that to go up in the Y. So We'll do an array. We'll have to play with this offset here. If this is jumping around too much, we can hold down shift. And right now you see that holding down shift is not working. So this is our magical number that we'll need in the X here. So now with the right factor, we could simply just bump up the count, and I'll set this to about 18. What we could do at this point is duplicate the array modifier. We can go in here and simply do duplicate. So we'll zero this out and we'll input a value here in the Y. And now we're building this in the Y direction. Again, we can hold down shift, get more gradual control. We could zoom in into this gap here. So I'm just manually putting a number in between just to get a little bit more precision. And maybe the 7 will be the lucky number again, which it is. So since this has two different array modifiers, I actually want to weld them all. Now we do have a merge option, but I think the safest bet is to do a weld that sits pretty much on top of this. That way it welds everything together. And a litmus test here, if you want to make sure that your verts are welded, you could always add a subsurf modifier here. And you see that this is not being all welded. So let's actually play with the distance. And there we go. We'll add another modifier here, which is going to be the solidify. Make sure that this is at the bottom, and we'll just bump up the thickness here. We could run the edge data from the bevel here, but sometimes what I like to do that gives me a little bit more control is actually apply a more manual bevel instead of just relying what comes from the solidify. I think I'm going to get a better result once the solidify is applied. So I'm going to hold off on this. So what I want to do is actually deform this and bend it into a cylindrical shape. However, we have a lot of modifiers. What I want to do is kind of bake all this down, but preserve my original pattern just in case I got to revert to this. This is a very useful workflow, especially when you're about to merge down your modifiers. It's just to save a copy with all those modifiers. I'll simply rename this. I'll do Shift D to create a copy. We'll simply hide the backup. I'll do baked. That way I know all my modifiers are baked. Naming convention just has to make sense to you. From this point, we can simply start applying our modifiers here. We'll add a simple deform. We'll do a bend in the Z. And usually the trick that I found this to work with the simple deform, especially with the bend, is kind of find the axes that starts to move in the direction you want, and then just rotate your object. So we're going to shift this to 90, but simply apply those transforms. So I'll do Control A, do rotation, and now you see that since we applied it, now the Z is starting to work properly, and all we got to do is just bump this up. If you're falling a little short here, what we can do is actually input a higher value, even though it won't let you scrub. If you do 370, now you see that this is actually indeed expanded. We can peel this back. Now we do have the issue of these faces need to be taken care of to create a watertight mesh. Not a problem. We could thankfully disable the modifier here in edit mode. So we'll hit tab to dive into it, and we simply just got to gut this out. I'll go ahead and select this range here, delete these faces, and do exactly the same on the side here as well. Now we can visualize our deformer, and this looks pretty good. We could add a weld just to take care of those verts, make sure that they're merged. And a test to see if all your verts are welded properly is just drop a sub D modifier and look around. And if you don't see any issues, that means that your verts are merged. If we disable the weld, we see what it looked like without it. Enabled here, it looks exactly the same now. I want to keep my honeycomb pattern, so I'll simply delete the subdivision modifier. The last order of business here is let's add some bevels. Now we don't want to select all these by hand, so I'll select this inner loop here, and I'll do Shift G. We'll select by normal, and now we can go back to select. We can do select loops and do a select boundary loop, and now we have effectively selected all the edges that we want to bevel. So we can do Control B. I think this looks good. We'll go back to edit mode. Now I know I got some jankiness and some clipping here. We could either delete this, adjust the bevel, but I actually created these caps here to finish out this piece. So I quickly added these caps, and this is our final staggered pattern. You made it to the final and most challenging part. Nice work. We'll finally be tackling the weave pattern. This is one of the most advanced and will involve using instances plus a powerful Blender add-on to help us set it up. Stick with me, and by the end of this, you will have mastered one of the hardest patterns to pull off in Blender. Let's get started. I'm going to start with a curve and a path. This is going to allow us to create a circular shape very easily compared to starting with a cylinder. I'll hit tab here to access the edit points of the curve. I'll access soft select, and I'll also make sure that I have these snap settings. Essentially what I want to do is snap to the grid. So with this middle point selected, I'll do G, Y, and make sure that everything but these outer 2 points are selected. And now I'm pushing down. I'm actually going to snap 8 times here. I'll also select both of these, hit O to disable proportional editing, and then I'll kind of just nudge these 2 points down as well. Now I'm going to actually create an instance. This is going to keep everything nice and fluid and allow us to make changes across this pattern. So I'll do Alt D. So I'll do R to rotate, Z to work on the Z axis, 180 to flip this. I'll hit enter. G again with snap. You see that I'm able to get this pretty precise. So now we kind of have these two curves, and that shouldn't give us much problems when creating this weave. So the next order of business is to actually create the initial thickness. And the nice thing about Blender is that within the data property of these curves, we have that ability with no added modifiers needed. Under bevel, if we start giving this some depth, you see that what we start to create. I think 0.5 is going to work well for me. So we'll do 0.5 here. We want to bring down the divisions here. This is way too dense for what we need, especially if we're doing a sub D workflow. And for that, we can go up here, and in the resolution preview, we could actually bump this down quite a bit. I think 2 is actually going to work. And this is a little too dense, so we could even control that as well by playing around with the resolution here. And I think this works perfectly for what we're trying to do. So now that this initial zigzag is built, we need 4 more of these. So I'll select both of these, and I'll do Alt D again to create another instance. So I'll rotate this 90 in the Y, and now I'll simply go here to this right view by hitting 3, and I'll drop this down. So now kind of this first piece of the pattern has fallen. We could even try enabling snapping again and see if we get more precise snapping. And what I want to do essentially is make sure this meets up with the widest part of this curve, which it looks like it's doing. So now we're halfway through. We have to repeat this 2 more times. So I'll take this piece here, and I haven't really shown you the power of instances. So with instances, all the changes are going to get passed along. We need to go back to the curve and make any edits here. You see how flexible this system is, but I think we're on the right track with this. I'm going to undo this, and let's finish this initial pattern out. I'll select both of these. Again, I'll do Alt D to create another instance. This one needs to be flipped. So we'll do R, Z, 180. This is going to flip this. And now we could simply take this, push it off in the Z. We could enable snapping again, see if we get a more precise position. Looks like we are. And now the final one is this one here. So again, Alt D to create that instance. X. This needs to be rotated 180 in the X. We'll want to switch to a right view here. We'll plop this down, and we want to make sure that we're pretty much in the middle of this face. This looks good. So it looks like we have our initial pattern completed. So this is an incredibly powerful system that we built, because any adjustments to 1/8 of this will be replicated all the way throughout. So we could adjust the pattern's shape with the curve, for example, but if we needed more thickness here, we could always go back to the data and simply bump up the depth here on this bevel. So you see how incredibly flexible this system is and how incredibly painful it would be to go without it. I'm actually liking the added thickness, but I think it's a little bit too thick here. So we'll bump this down. And I'm going to use a sub D modifier. So this actually might end up shrinking just a tad. I think something like this looks good. Just to be safe, we can select all these, do Control 2, apply that sub D modifier, and look at this kind of in its final form, and this looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and finalize this pattern. What I'll do is, again, I'll move this over to a collection, name this Weave, and then I'll do Shift D to create a duplicate. We're going to go ahead and actually convert this to a mesh. This is still a curve object, so we're going to need to do Object, Convert, and Mesh. Now this is a polygonal mesh. From this point, we'll join this by doing Control J, going to edit mode, and we could actually hide the rest of these here. We'll select one vert, hit A for all, M, merge by distance, and if we drop a sub D modifier, we see that all our verts are merged. So I'm actually going to take the sub D modifier off for the time being. If we wanted to do similar patterns as before, we would do something like an array. So by doing a set of 2 arrays, we can see that this is pretty much in the standard definition, a perfect repeatable pattern. Everything lines up perfect, and then we could simply combine this and do a simple deform or any other of deformation that we need. We're going to do a more complex type of deformation, so this pattern is going to require a small tweak. I'm going to remove both array modifiers, and we're going to use a tissue modifier to create a more complex shape that would be kind of impossible to do otherwise. The problem with the tissue modifier, it took me about an hour figuring this out, even though the array actually created a full pattern. The tissue needs a perfectly square bounding box. So these angles here, when the tissue is applied, are going to create this spacing that's impossible to bridge, even with the merge option. We have to be a little creative, and we're not going to get as pristine as topology, but overall the pattern's going to work fine just by doing this simple tweak. I'll jump here to the top. Within edit mode, I'm going to go ahead and create some cuts, and essentially what I'm trying to do with the knife tool is delete any angles here, and this is going to create a perfect bounding box. So with wireframe enabled, I'm just going to simply use the knife tool to get rid of any of these angles. The other way that this could be done is with the scaling tool. However, I think that's going to be a little bit more destructive. I'm going to go right about here, and what I can probably do is actually snap to the grid to get a little bit more precision. Again, we'll use absolute snap increments and just enable snap. So now I'm going to select the knife tool, make sure that it's pretty close to this corner vert. Use the Y constraint, hit C to cut all the way through, and now we should have a clean cut. Now with this selected, I can hit V. This is going to enable my rip command. That's exactly what I want. So now that these are disconnected, I can select one of these, hit L for length, delete the faces, hit L for length, delete these faces, and I'm going to repeat the same exact process on every single side. This way this fits in a perfect square volume. The last thing that I'll do is actually mark these as a seam. So I'll do Shift G, and then I'll do amount of faces around edge. It's going to get every border edge here. I'll right click and we'll do mark seam. This will actually come into play in this last stage. So last thing needed, I'm going to rotate this 90. For some reason the tissue add-on likes things to be laying down on the ground here. With that, we can go ahead and apply this rotation. And now comes the fun part. I'll do Shift A and I'll get a round cube. So this round cube doesn't look too round until you increase the radius. Once we kind of just cap this out, it's going to be a circle no matter what, but we want some more divisions. So what we'll do is here under arc, we'll give this as many divisions that we need. And basically for every face that we have here, we're going to have one of these patterns there. And this would be an impossible pattern to do with other methods. I'm going to push this out the way. I'll select my pattern first and then my template second. I'll hit N. If you don't see tissue here, most likely you don't have it installed. Go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, Tissue, and then just tick it on and you should be good to go. So we'll select again my pattern here, my template, tissue, tessellate, quad, which is what we want. Keep this at relative. If not, it'll kind of mess with your scales. Hit OK. Let this thing think. We'll go ahead and isolate only the pattern here, and we're pretty close to home. And you see what we did here with the border edges. If we would have left the pattern by itself, it would have been impossible to connect because this gap would be so wide. How do we bridge this small gap? This is not a modifier. This is going to be under data, and under tissue, we can go ahead and simply merge this. Let's zoom in here. We're going to use a low value because I think we got pretty close, and that's it. So 0.3 did the trick. Now, we kind of jacked up the edge flow here. The beauty about this is that we could actually dissolve seams, and this is why we marked those hard edges for dissolved seams. So I'm gonna check this. There we go. Relatively clean, not as clean as I really wanted to because I really like that perfect spacing, but we're gonna do Control 2, add a sub D modifier, and we're not gonna be able to tell the difference. And here is our finished pattern. And if we hide the wireframe, this thing is a thing of beauty, and this would be impossible to create otherwise without the tissue. And there you have it, folks. This is the weave pattern. And that's a wrap, folks. Congratulations on leveling up your hard surface modeling skills by mastering these 3 essential pattern techniques in Blender. Now I want to hear from you. What was your favorite pattern? Is there a pattern that I missed that should have made the list? Drop them in the comments down below. I'll read every one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button so you don't miss any more 3D modeling tricks to boost your skills. There's a lot more content that I plan on dropping, and I'm here to help you work smarter and create faster. Now that you mastered creating any hard surface pattern in Blender, it's time to take things up a notch. These patterns are often found on more complex hard surface models, especially those with curved surfaces. But here's the catch: creating clean topology on those curved surfaces without shading issues like pinching can be a real challenge. You can check out my video on creating hard surface models in Blender with clean topology, free from shading issues, right here.